It is possible to have more than one pivot table based on a single set of data. Taking the employees single pivot file, you'll find we have the employees data, but with a pivot table. And the pivot table is counting how many employees there are in each department. If we also wanted a pivot table that counted how many employees we had of each marital status and of each gender, then we would need a second and a third pivot table. Now, to generate the second and third pivot table, we simply click back into the employees sheet, insert pivot table. That way it selects the right data. Do I want to put it on a new worksheet? No, we're going to put it into an existing worksheet, but not the existing worksheet. So we go to the browse, we go to pivots, and then we need to choose a cell where the pivot table will start. So effectively, this is the top left-hand point of the pivot table. So the location of my pivot table is pivots, which is the name of the sheet, E3. Okay. And you can see it puts the placeholder in place of where I said, let's have the pivot table. Now this time I wanted it to be the marital status and counting the ID. Now because ID is actually a numeric field, it defaults to sum, but we know we can change that through the value field settings to count. So I have 43 married, 9 divorced, 47 single and 1 blank. Now, when you place a second pivot table on a sheet with an existing pivot table, just be careful that this pivot table here will not grow at some point and overlap this one. Otherwise, we'll run into real problems. So you've got to be careful where you place secondary and tertiary and fourth pivot tables. Because if any of the previous pivot tables grow to overlap, then we'll hit an issue because it cannot grow. So if we want a third one, we again go back to the employees, click in, insert pivot table, picks the correct range, existing worksheet, where I want to go to the pivot one. Now this is going to be the number of employees by each gender, so it's only going to be a little table. Place it there, back, okay, and then we can take our ID into the values again, changing it to count instead of sum. And then bring the sex field in this case into the rows. So we have 63 males and 37 females, because I know that in the data, 1 is male and 2 is female. Now, if I try to change this pivot table here so that effectively it will overlap that pivot table there, which I can do by removing the marital status, let's make that a column heading in fact, and placing the town into the rows, you'll find a pivot table report cannot overlap another pivot table report. So it's not able to do it. So I cannot do what I wanted to do in that case because I haven't planned for that growth. So let's put the marital status back in the rows and we're happy to go. So it's just a caveat to be aware when you drop a second or a third pivot table onto a sheet that you're then restricting the growth of any of the other pivot tables. So for example, this one here cannot go any further than 2 more columns to the right. If we were, as an example, to try and move department to the column headings, it wouldn't be able to because it would have to overlap this table here. So that's restricted to growth that way. It can go downwards if there's more departments, it will grow that way. This one's restricted downwards, but not horizontally, that can keep going. Now the third one is not restricted because it can go to the right and it can go downwards. So it's just having a little bit of forethought when you're planning where your pivot tables go. Apart from that, you can have as many as you like, there's no restriction. We just go back to the data, click in, insert pivot table, it chooses the correct data, and I'm going to place it in the same sheet. There isn't any need to place it in the same sheet. You could create a new sheet every time, so each pivot table could be in a separate worksheet. Let's start this one here. Okay, and that way we're then going to add a restriction to growth on that one. Let's put the salary in the values and it will default to count there. Let's change that back to sum. And then department in the rows, marital status in the columns. And we've got a rather larger pivot table with columns and row labels, and then some summing of the salary in the middle, which we can format in accounting so that it's in money. Okay, so number of pivot tables is not restricted. They can all do slightly different things. The thing to be careful of is allowing growth for any pivot table that might need to grow if the data changes.